Good afternoon, everybody. This study is entitled Phonetic Variation of Vietnamese Tones in Disyllabic Utterances. It's from Mieko S. Han and Kong-won Kim and was published in the Journal of Phonetics, Volume 2 in 1974. And I am Ivy Gilbert. I'll be presenting this study for you. This study analyzes the phonetic profiles and environments of 6 tones in the Hanoi dialect of Vietnamese. It's primarily based upon an earlier study from one of the authors, Mieko Han, which was the first study to document the phonetic and phonological profiles of Vietnamese tones in monosyllables. The present study extends the findings from that study to disyllabic utterances. And the present study seeks both to identify phonetic variation of the 6 tones depending on their tonal environment and to understand the broader interaction of tone contour and intonation contour in tonal languages. Hanoi dialect is the standard dialect of Vietnamese. It's spoken in the northern region of Vietnam, encompassing the northeast, northwest, the Red River Delta, and the upper part of the north-central coast. For this reason, it's sometimes referred to as Northern Vietnamese. For those of you who haven't seen Vietnamese before, it's an Austroasiatic language of the analytic and specifically the isolating morphological type. It's also a tonal language, meaning that each syllable has an inherent pitch contour. It's this pitch contour that differentiates between minimal pairs. And this dialect uses 6 discrete tones as compared with the southern dialects that use only 5. And these 6 different syllable tones appear over the nucleus as a diacritic. I'd like you to watch an introductory overview of Vietnamese tones, which demonstrates how the tones distinguish between sets of minimal pairs. So please click the link in the description below this video and watch that video before moving on to my next slide. The 6 tones used in Hanoi dialect are multidimensional. They differ in duration, pitch contour, pitch height, and phonation. These 6 tones have Vietnamese names, but as I cannot pronounce them, I'll refer to the tones going forward by their directional names. So figure 1 on the right comes from a study published roughly 25 years after the publication of the present study from Han and Kim, but I wanted to share it because I think it's helpful in illustrating these 4 major tonal dimensions. For instance, duration is the length of the pitch line. We can see that the drop tone, which is in red, has shorter duration than the broken tone in pink. Pitch contour refers to the shape of the pitch line, whether it falls or rises or curves, and we can see that this varies widely. Again, comparing the drop tone to the broken tone, the drop tone has a medium beginning pitch and then quickly drops, while the broken tone begins at a higher pitch at the onset and becomes even higher as it goes on, breaking off somewhere in the middle and then climbing upwards again. Pitch height is the level of pitch, so we can see that the drop tone, again in red, is altogether lower in pitch height than the broken tone. The final dimension, phonation, is evident on the broken tone and the drop tone, which are both heavily constricted. Creaky voicing is an inherent feature of the broken tone, while mild constriction is necessary for the rapid fall in the drop tone. Han and Kim did not pose any research questions or hypotheses in this study. Rather, the study is exploratory in nature, seeking to not only extend the scope of the earlier study from Han, but also to flesh out the direction of influence from one tone to another in disyllabic utterances. With respect to methodology, this study examined the speech of 4 participants, called informants 1 through 4. 1 and 2 were female and 3 and 4 were male. For reasons not explained by the researchers, the analysis published here is based upon the data from only informant 1, which was then confirmed against the data from the other informants. The data were collected using an Ampex model PR10 tape recorder in a soundproof room. Informants were analyzed for their production of both monosyllabic and disyllabic utterances. The 81 monosyllabic utterances served as a control against which the 559 disyllabic utterances in the experimental condition could be measured. The monosyllabic utterances contained all 6 tone contours, while the disyllabic utterances included all possible combinations of the 6 tones across 2 syllables, totaling 36 combinations. The researchers attempted to control the stimulus list for various factors known to affect fundamental frequency, namely the effect of voicing in the onset consonant on the following vowel, with House and Fairbanks identifying a small difference in pitch depending on whether the consonant was voiced or voiceless, and the identity of the nucleus vowel itself, with Hahn finding a 20 Hz difference in pitch between high and low vowels in Vietnamese. Here's a sample of a disyllabic stimulus item an informant may have seen. Informants were asked to read a frame sentence, which means in English, I read the word, and then insert the disyllabic utterance with 4 repetitions. Informants were instructed to insert approximately 40 to 50 milliseconds between each repetition, with the exception of the first, which was read immediately following the frame sentence. So here's an example, which I'll do in English to help you visualize, using the disyllabic English word rumor instead of the full translation to hear a rumor. I read the word rumor, 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 rumor. This first repetition, the one read immediately after the frame sentence, was excluded from analysis because of the influence of the final frame sentence syllable on its production. For measuring fundamental frequency, the researchers set 3 criteria. First, for syllables beginning with consonants, the onset of the tone was located at the onset of the vowel preceding the syllable initial consonant, because the researchers observed that voiced syllable initial consonants have little effect on the overall pitch contour. Second, syllable final nasal consonants were considered important in determining pitch contour and thus were included in the pitch measurement. Third, only points between the onset and end of a tone where a significant pitch change occurred were measured. So while every tone was measured in terms of beginning and end, only some had intermediate measurements. And finally, these measurements were analyzed with respect to the major dimensions outlined before: duration, contour, and height. Variation of the tones themselves were then analyzed in 2 regards. First, by the environmental influence on individual tones and disyllabic utterances, and second, by the environmental influence on patterns of contrast across tones. For the latter, the authors chose the following 4 environments: the first syllable before a level tone, the first syllable before a falling tone, the second syllable after a rising tone, and the second syllable after a curved tone. These 4 environments were selected based on the findings of the analysis of environmental influence on individual tones. And they were chosen because in that analysis, they were the tones found to have the greatest modification under the influence of adjacent tones. In Figure 2, we can see where the researchers outlined the most salient qualities of the 6 tones. So here are the pitch contours of the 6 tones in monosyllabic test utterances. And this basically takes the baseline of the tonal characteristics. Very broadly speaking, we can see that the level tone, rising tone, and broken tone all have relatively high onset, whereas the falling tone, curved tone, and drop tone have much lower onset. There are other features that are evident related to pitch contour. For instance, we can see the broken tone has a steep drop and then another steep incline with some phonation in the middle due to creaky voicing. And other tones, we can see their baseline characteristics, whether they have gradual drop, whether they stay relatively level, such as the level tone. And so this is the baseline against which the disyllabic utterances will be compared. The main finding at the level of individual tonal variation is that pitch height and contour is affected by tonal environment. That is to say, it's affected by the preceding or subsequent tone. Tones tend to skew higher before or after a broken, rising, or level tone. And this is unsurprising given that these are the types of tones we saw have higher overall pitch, which pulls up the pitch of the other tones in the utterance, so to speak. Similarly, tones skew lower before or after a curved or falling tone, which we saw are tones with lower pitch. So these lower pitch tones pull down the adjacent tones. And here in Figure 3 are the findings for the first syllables. The trajectories of each type of tone in the first syllable position in their 2 extreme variants are shown here. That is the lowest and highest extremities of the measurements for that tone. The tags that show in parentheses the name and type of tone This reflects which type of tone was in the following syllable of the disyllabic utterance. So take a look at B, the rising tone. It's on the top in the center. When it preceded another rising tone, a first syllable rising tone was much higher pitched. When it preceded a falling tone, which we know from the graphs that we saw earlier has an overall lower pitch at both the onset and the end point, the first syllable rising tone is much lower in anticipation of that subsequent low falling tone. So to summarize, with respect to the individual variation, the authors conclude that there is a clear reciprocal influence between adjacent syllable tones. Here in Figure 4, we see the findings of the analysis of tonal patterns. The upper half of the chart shows the level and falling tones in the second syllable position. So we're looking at how the 6 tones vary when they precede a level or falling tone. The authors found that for these two types, the pitch ranges were consistent with those in the monosyllables. However, the endpoints were influenced by the following syllable. For example, the broken tone typically has a very high endpoint, but here, when preceding the level tone and falling tone with their low-pitched onsets, the broken tone's endpoint is significantly lower due to anticipation of the following syllable. And in the bottom half of Figure 4, we see how they vary when they follow rising or curved tones. So recall that the rising and curved tones both end in a higher pitch than most other tones and are distinguished by their steep pitch contour. So by examining them in the first syllable position, it's easy to see how they manipulate the tones that follow them. It's clear that in the second position, the pitch level and contour are both heavily influenced by the preceding syllable. So consider the following tone, and it is the 4th tone down on each chart, and it looks like an apostrophe. When following the rising tone, its contour has a gradual downward slope. When following the curved tone, its contour adopts a convex shape. And we can also, of course, compare these two charts to see the vastly different onset pitch levels for the second syllable tones. After analyzing the tonal patterns, the results demonstrate that all 6 tones are in a contrastive relationship and that they do not generally overlap with one another at any point, despite being influenced by their environments. In conclusion, the main findings are the following. Tonal pitch height was influenced by environment and by syllable position. The authors found that this influence is bidirectional. That is, the first syllable may affect the second, and the second may affect the first. They found as well that tones adjacent to high tones, like the level, rising, and broken tones, are higher than those tones that are adjacent to low tones, such as the falling, curve, and drop tones. Phonetic variation appeared to be greater in the second syllable. The authors hypothesized that this is potentially due to perseverant or anticipatory assimilation in Vietnamese, with a possibility that Vietnamese favors perseverant assimilation. The authors also found that 2 variants of the same tone do not intersect, and that patterns of contrast are relatively stable despite variation. I have little critique of the article, but there were a few things I felt could have been addressed. First, the authors did not publish a stimulus list and only gave one example of a stimulus item, and it's the one that we looked at before, to hear a rumor. They also did not give any explanation as to what kinds of stimulus items were used. It was unclear to me whether they were using verb phrases and noun phrases made up of 2 syllables, or whether there were other types of phrases used, such as adjective-noun combinations, or any of the numerous classifiers and quantifiers used in Vietnamese. Because each syllable in Vietnamese has an inherent tone, I'm unsure of whether this would matter at all, but I was left with the question of whether perhaps certain combinations of lexical classes have different intonational patterns. The authors at one point do mention that it would be interesting to examine how these patterns extend to entire phrases or sentences, which leads me to suspect that intonation does change by phrase, at least slightly, and is not locked only onto the syllable tone. Secondly, their exclusion of the 3 participants beyond Informant 1 was not explained or justified at any point, and as a consequence, it's difficult to know whether the findings are generalizable. Additionally, there was no extra linguistic demographic information provided for the informants beyond speaker sex, such as age. And there was also no information provided as to the specifics of the data collection and analysis beyond the mention of the type of instrument used for recording. Third, in the very conclusion of the paper, the authors note briefly that the greater influence of the first tone on the second may be due to a preference for perseverant assimilation in Vietnamese. This was a compelling hypothesis, in my opinion, and I would have been interested in hearing much more about it, but it was not addressed elsewhere, not in the introduction or background literature, and not in the discussion. I think that this would make an interesting research question for a future study. And finally, one of the stated aims of this study was to, quote, lead us to a better understanding of the interaction between tone contour and intonation contour in tone languages. The authors never again mention other tonal languages or attempt to propose a broader theory of this interaction that could be applicable to other tonal languages, so this too is an avenue for future research. Here are my references, and thank you so much for listening.